Welcome back to Unconventional, Episode 7, a limited series on criminal justice reform and the role it plays in our politics. This week, we're talking about mental health and substance abuse in a two-part episode. First, we'll be joined by Sheila Vicaria, Deputy Director of Research and Academic Engagement for the Drug Policy Alliance, and Amanda Hall, Policy Strategist for Smart Justice at the ACLU of Kentucky. We'll hear about how the conversation around drug use and dependency has changed, some new strategies and policies for being implemented to address it, and what the future may hold for this area of reform. Then stick around for author and advocate Kelly Ashby Paul in conversation with Brian Lewis and John Calloway from Hope House Ministries in Bowling Green, Kentucky. They're going to talk about Hope House's recovery model, how they address the spiritual, emotional, educational, and physical needs of their residents. So let's kick off part one. I'm going to start with Sheila. You're working in advocacy now, but I noticed you've also practiced as a clinical social worker. Can you tell us a little bit about how that background and the approaches you saw in practice have informed your current work?
Absolutely, and thank you again so much for having us here today. It's such a privilege. So I was one of those people who grew up wanting to help people, and the immediate path that I saw was through direct service and working with people directly. And I discovered that I really enjoyed and valued working with people who use drugs. And that actually started in a traditional abstinence-only 12-step outpatient program. And again, I developed a deep commitment to the community and to the population. However, I really struggled with the approach to care that we provided and the ways in which we were really complicit with the criminal legal system and mandated clients, many of whom got violated and sent home or sent back to jail or prison rather than being able to access care because of simple positive drug screens. And so it really led to me having to question my approach to treatment. And I went straight from there to a syringe exchange program where I was the mental health provider and working with people who use drugs in a far less restrictive environment where I could really engage with people where they were at. And, long story short, over the years, direct service was a tremendous way to learn about the dynamics on the ground and what some of the needs were. But it's hard to navigate direct service work when so many of the barriers you face in direct services can be directly linked back to policies that really make direct service work challenging, right? Because so much of what happens on the ground is directly impacted by policy constraints. And so, that's kind of how I got from one to the other.
And Amanda, you've also spoken a lot about how your life experience has informed your advocacy. It's been really moving to hear, and I wondered if you could share that with our audience.
Absolutely, and I just want to echo, thank you so much for having us. So I am originally from Eastern Kentucky. I live there now also, so Appalachia. And substance use disorder and folks using drugs has been a part of my life since I can remember. And, watching family members and other folks around me suffer from mental health and substance use disorder has really impacted my life. And as a teenager with some mental health issues of my own, suffering from generalized anxiety disorder, and starting to experiment with drugs and alcohol earlier on. And then I was actually in the right spot, in the right time, or maybe the wrong spot in the wrong time when the opioid overprescribing really hit Eastern Kentucky. I was prescribed opioids in my teenage years and grew very dependent on them. I started cycling in and out of the criminal legal system. I also used a variety of other drugs as well, and seen this as a way to cope with some of the issues that I had early on. I finally ended up in prison in my mid-20s, and upon parole, I remember being in jail and in prison, and throughout that whole time, I had asked for help. By this time, I knew I needed it. I'd actually cycled in and out of various psychiatric facilities and detox centers from where I was from. We didn't have many. I remember the last real detox center I was able to access, I had to travel over an hour, and that was really rough. And but I never had a continuum of care after that, or how to cope with the issues that I had. And so in jail and prison, I asked for, can someone help me? Is there some kind of program? Is there something? And I was put on waiting lists the whole time that I was incarcerated. I was in there for 13 months, and I'd actually received 2 5-year sentences for 2 prescription pills. And so I finally was able to access a recovery program after prison. And, I almost went back to prison because I relapsed, which is very normal. And, I just happened to pass that drug test, but wasn't able to be honest with the folks providing my care for fear of being incarcerated again. I am a person in long-term recovery now. That's 8 years, and worked in also a 12-step abstinence based program. And, I love that program, but I saw that didn't work for everyone. So I became interested in harm reduction. I became interested in other pathways to recovery. And that's sort of where my heart is now, is seeing folks who use drugs, seeing folks who are in recovery, understanding the different pathways. And so now I work on reforms to the criminal legal system, because I see, especially in the state of Kentucky, how all of those are so intertwined. And that's what I do now.
And you've built an incredible team of advocates, many of whom have been directly impacted by the system. Why do you think it's important for policymakers and legislators to hear from directly impacted people?
I mean, it's vital. It's so important to hear from those folks because we have that lived experience. We know how the criminal legal system treats folks with mental health and substance use disorder. We know the lack of resources. Not only do we have a big bench of advocates, but we make sure that bench is very diverse. As a little white girl from rural Kentucky, not until really I was involved in the system was I able to see some of the racial disparities, some of the lack of diverse programming. So we have advocates from our rural areas, from our urban areas throughout the state of Kentucky, and all those different recovery stories and different pathways and where the system, where there's gaps, really has made a huge impact on lawmakers whose heart is really in addressing this issue and really want to know how. And these folks have the answers. They have the answers from their experience, their loved ones' experiences, and we think it's very important to get all those voices at the table to build a holistic policy approach to this issue to make Kentucky a better place.
Now, one thing that's come up a little bit already is the idea of harm reduction. So for folks who are not necessarily as plugged into this area, I wondered, Sheila, if you could tell people a little bit more about what that term means in this context.
So harm reduction as a movement can trace its roots to the 1980s when a drug user union in the Netherlands had identified that they had noticed that members of their community were starting to get sick, and they didn't really know what it was, right? This is at the beginning of what we consider the HIV/AIDS crisis. And one of the factors that they identified as potentially contributing to it was the fact that they were sharing syringes oftentimes because they were in short supply. And so the first ever syringe exchange programs that we can think of can be traced back to these efforts by people who use drugs, who decided to take care of themselves where systems and structures were not really built to support them. And over the past several decades now, this has grown into a broader movement in which really it's an acknowledgement that people are going to engage in high-risk practices. We do it every day. We drive cars. We take various substances that come with risks, including ones that are currently legal. Alcohol is a great example. And we have to acknowledge that people are willing to tolerate a certain degree of risk to engage in certain behaviors. And there are ways to meet people where they're at when they're engaging in those behaviors to help them stay safe, right? So designated drivers programs, seat belts, airbags, all of these kinds of programs already exist to reduce the harms associated with behaviors that people choose to engage in and have the autonomy to choose to engage in. And so when we think about drug use specifically, harm reduction can mean a variety of things, but first and foremost, it's a philosophy of care and understanding, and it's a broader respect of people's autonomy and ability to make choices for themselves, and that when they're given good options and options to stay safe, they will embrace them, because people do fundamentally want to take care of themselves and their communities. And so first and foremost, it's a philosophy and it's an approach to care and caring for a community. And it's the name of a larger movement, but then it also is embodied through various interventions and practices and policies. So harm reduction can include syringe access, right? Sterile syringe access and sterile syringe service programs. It can include the provision of naloxone or Narcan, which is the overdose reversal drug. It can include safer consumption spaces where people can go and consume pre-obtained substances in a safer setting, but it can include a variety of things. So it is a philosophy, it is a community, it is a series of interventions, it is quite big.
Great. It seems like we made a lot of progress in the way we talk about drug use and dependency in recent years, but some of the policies are still catching up. What do you think are some of the most urgent structural or policy changes that are needed to implement to actually reduce harm, provide alternatives to incarceration, or help people who are struggling with dependency? I think here we'll start with Amanda.
Yeah, so this is a question that has many different answers. I think we'll look Kentucky specific. Kentucky has done some great things around harm reduction. You know, we have the most syringe exchange sites. We did, unless this has changed very recently, than any state. You know, that's a huge thing that Kentucky has done. But some of our policies are lacking. You know, something that we have advocated for a long time is to decrease felony possession. Right now in the state, we have so many folks with felonies on their record that impact the rest of their lives due to possession. Often, you know, those folks have substance use disorders. So that's one huge thing that we can do. Some other things that we could do right now, Kentucky is also doing something that's very different. Just 2 days ago, and it's open for public comment. Kentucky has made an 1115 waiver to provide Medicaid services for folks incarcerated around substance use disorder. So, you know, hopefully that waiver gets approved. We would be the first state. That will mean peer support for folks incarcerated. That can mean some, you know, some great case management upon reentry. We also, with our syringe exchanges that we have to continue to fight even to expand those around the state. You know, there was a bill a few years ago around limiting some of our syringe exchanges, and I was very heartened. It made me very hopeful. The sponsor of that bill met with me and really listened to how important those were. So we have to continue to keep those policies in place and not, you know, decrease their effectiveness, but to, you know, continue to expand. You know, I think we need more pretrial diversion here in the state. There's so many things, you know, for a long time, Kentucky was focused only on opioids. A lot of our funding for a lot of our programming was only opioids. And though, you know, that was the drug that I used the most often, as I mentioned in my story, I used other drugs. It was truly, you know, a substance use disorder. So we're finally coming around and including different drugs in that funding, and that has to continue. I was just on a call a few minutes ago when we were talking about this. It's whack-a-mole, you know. Right now it may be opioids, and then we still have you know, cocaine, crack, a lot of our rural communities with methamphetamines. We have to see this as truly what it is, and not just have that funding tied specifically. So there's so many, from, you know, as I spoke about, diversion to harm reduction to reclassification of that felony drug possession. so I should probably be quiet. But we have a whole other list that advocates talk about. But yeah, there's really an opportunity here to change some of these policies to really have a huge impact.
So I think the question was maybe a little too broad. So let me narrow it a little for you,
Sure.
Sheila. Are there places that you think are doing this effectively? Are there jurisdictions that you would point people to, or programs that you would point people to as an example?
Well, just to take an opportunity to highlight some of the work that DPA is doing, one really exciting piece of legislation that is going to make its way onto the ballot in Oregon is an all-drug decriminalization initiative that our advocacy arm, Drug Policy Action, has helped supported in coalition and partnership with numerous organizations on the ground in Oregon and the community on the ground in Oregon. And the exciting aspect of thinking about drug decriminalization in a state like Oregon is that it can really kind of create the understanding that like this is what it can look like. I think that we live in a democracy, and we live in a country in which there's 50 unique experiments happening at any given time from state to state. And I feel like the Oregon kind of experiment could really provide a reference point for a lot of us around the country in thinking of innovative strategies to approach drug use. And so by decriminalizing drugs and any drug classification in that category for personal possession, it means that it is no longer a criminal offense. So it's not something that would require getting arrested and getting booked and getting charged and sentenced and all of that sort of thing. Instead, people would have the opportunity to speak to a panel of health professionals and be sent to them to talk about what are some other things that are happening in your life right now. Do you need supportive housing? Do you need access to a treatment program in a non-coercive structured setting to really acknowledge where you're at, and that sometimes we're going to see ups and downs, and sometimes having the hammer of the criminal justice system hanging over your head means that one slip up that you're sent back, right? So, I think that that's a really great model for where this country should go. So just to let you all know that just a few days ago, the FBI released their most recent arrest statistics for 2019. And what they found was that there were over 10 million arrests in the United States last year, looking at all the states. And of those 10 million arrests, 1.5 million of those arrests were drug abuse violation arrests alone. 15% of arrests in 2019 were drug-related offenses. And then when you specifically tease that apart, 86% of them were for simple possession alone. And so those are the people that we're talking about, people who are probably just in possession for their own personal habit, for their own personal use, right? So if 86% of our arrest efforts are targeting low-level charges for people in possession for their personal use, it means that we're targeting social and recreational users perhaps, but also people with substance use disorders. And again, instead of directly connecting them with services and supports that can be helpful and useful to them, they are instead having contact with law enforcement. And potentially, although maybe not all of those arrests are resulting in incarceration and serving time, contact with the law enforcement system by itself is harmful. An arrest is harmful. We know that 70% of all people in jails are there for pre-trial, detention. We know that, some people are going to get subjected to parole or probation or perhaps drug courts. But that again is too many people caught in the net of the justice system when obviously there's other issues at play. And so, we have to bring it back to the sense that, we need innovative solutions for that 86%. And clearly, prioritizing drug law enforcement is not improving public health or public safety. People are getting arrested for drugs at higher rates than for other crimes that perhaps impact people's quality of lives and feelings of safety more than an individual choice to use a substance. So I'd say looking at what Oregon's going to do could really provide us with a model for how to move forward. And we at DPA have also proposed a federal piece of legislation, a model piece of legislation for what decriminalization could look like on a federal scale. And I think that these are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about. And then just to kind of like take a little sidebar, of those 86% of arrests that involve drug possession, 32% of all drug arrests, 1 in 3 of all drug arrests were for simple marijuana possession, right? So again, we have to think about marijuana reform as another way to move forward in really reducing the grasp and the net that the justice system has to cast over people. And even as we move forward with legalization on the state level, there are a number of states that still haven't moved forward with that legislation, and people are still being targeted and arrested. And, it's not just about autonomy of use, but it's really just about, leaving people alone, letting people make their own choices, and really acknowledging also beyond this that there's a racial and social kind of dynamic to who gets targeted with our drug laws, right? Black and brown people are disproportionately targeted by drug arrests, period. Right. And then we also just have to think about the role of class as well, low income communities. And when we think about people who are non-citizens, drug offenses, although may seem minor to many people, those can be grounds for deportation and the separation of families.
Amanda, are there any places that you think in Kentucky are doing innovative programs? Anything that you would point folks to?
Yeah, there's a lot of places in Kentucky. I think Voices of Health in Lexington, they are great. They do recovery coaching. They do all pathways to Kentucky to recovery, to include harm reduction. They are really they're a recovery community center of sorts, and now we are expanding those out. There's also the Louisville Recovery Community Center here that, again, it's all pathways to recovery. They make sure that harm reduction is an aspect that folks have access to. So I think these recovery community centers that are popping up is great, because you're able to find resources to the level of care that you need and want, which is huge. It isn't a one size fits all. Like I said, my recovery looks the way it does. That's not how other folks' recovery is. And I'm very something that breaks my heart often is sometimes people in recovery don't see it that way. So we're also, as an individual in recovery, we're really trying to break down that stigma. And yeah, so I'm really heartened to see the talks here around racial disparities in recovery. I just have to shout out our Kentucky Chamber of Commerce just last week held a panel on racial inequities in recovery in the criminal justice system, and Black Kentuckians in recovery told their stories and talked about reforms and their work with programs such as the ACLU Smart Justice Advocates. So y'all don't sleep on Kentucky. Like we're really stepping up to the plate, and it's truly led by folks in recovery and us all coming together. So I'm really heartened by all of those efforts.
Yeah, we as an organization spend quite a bit of time in Kentucky. It's one of our top tier states, and I'm always impressed in seeing some of the solutions that people come up with on the ground, and some of the innovative programs that people are executing in small communities or with these very limited block grants, and the work that people are able to do on this is just really inspiring. And I think that I'm intrigued to see what the next steps are. And I'm wondering if you guys have a sense of what is out there that feels, a little bit edgy or, a little too much right now, but you think will be considered commonplace in the coming years. Start with Sheila.
Well, as I mentioned, I think, marijuana reform and, all drug decriminalization need to be part of these conversations. I'd really love to see more of a movement more broadly. I think COVID has inspired some really interesting reforms that a lot of us have been waiting to see for some time now. And I think that, one of the few, if you're going to see a silver lining in any of this, loosened restrictions on access to medications for opioid use disorder, like looser prescribing guidelines in terms of, being able to do it via telehealth, I think is huge, but also, being able to get larger amounts of dosages to take home or to have access to. I think, even just like broader moves, although, we have to still track how much that's maintained, but, the efforts to decarcerate and to really like deprioritize certain drug level charges, and the fact that it really didn't negatively impact broader public safety, but also broader public health. I think that, some of these innovations that happened, I hope kind of destigmatize these policies, but also perhaps maybe normalize them a little bit and provide some credence to some of the things that places like ACLU and DPA have been advocating for a long time. The sky isn't going to fall if you loosen restrictions on medications. The sky isn't going to fall if you let people out of jails who haven't been convicted, or older folks who've been serving life sentences who, are at higher risk for getting sick inside than they would be if they were let go. So I think that, some of these innovations could potentially stick. But even the ones that we've seen haven't gone far enough, right? So we can't get complacent, because there's still barriers that exist for people who want medications. There still are communities which are still prioritizing drug laws, obviously too much, who are still keeping people under lock and key and want to keep them under state control. So on the one hand, I think it's a positive step forward, and I think it may provide some examples that people can turn to as successes to move forward, but also we should always be pushing the envelope and asking for more.
I think that's a great point. It's been such a natural experiment in what would happen if some of these restrictions were loosened, if folks were let out of prison after they were deemed not to be a threat to public safety. And so much of the rhetoric around what would happen just hasn't occurred. Like you said, the sky hasn't fallen, the negative consequences haven't happened, and people's lives have been improved. So, it's a small silver lining for a big pandemic, but we'll take it at this point. Amanda, is there anything else that you think, are sort of innovative programs that are being tried out that you think that we'll look back and think that it was obvious we should have been doing this?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned some of the programs earlier in Lexington and Louisville. Out in Eastern Kentucky, addiction recovery care here is really expanded, and their focus is really on also providing folks with employment, with records, folks with substance use disorder, and the training that they need. And our Chamber of Commerce has really pushed during COVID to make sure that we have lists of real-time jobs for folks with felony convictions. This is such a huge issue, especially in a state like Kentucky. We also see with COVID, as horrible as a pandemic this is, folks coming together. We have a bi-weekly reentry call that I just got off of, where folks from all around the state, every 2 weeks we get together. We put together Kentucky's most comprehensive resource guide that the state has ever seen, with housing, employment, faith-based entities, substance use disorder, or harm reduction, where all the syringe exchanges are, how to access naloxone, transportation, housing. That's been huge, and our Department of Corrections has started using that. We've also, through that, been able to develop a group of formerly incarcerated individuals, some new members to that group, and release an op-ed on steps to reentry, where we need to go in the future. And a huge part of that has to do with substance use disorder and harm reduction measures. And through that, we've started working on an ID campaign, which may seem very simple, but the fact that folks cannot get IDs, and so many folks that suffer from substance use disorder and mental health issues, and folks that are being released from our jails and prisons, it's a huge problem in Kentucky that existed before COVID, but will continue after if we don't do something about it. So the Smart Justice Advocates have started making informational videos with folks that have been released, talking about how important an ID is. And some of our jails in Kentucky that do provide IDs are actually making these videos too and advocating. So it's really exciting what the fact that folks from Kentucky, formerly incarcerated, and service providers have come together, over 80 folks, and provided this resource packet, on there. Where do we need naloxone? Where are housing in your community? It shows that there's an infrastructure of resources, though we need to add to them. But these folks do not need to be in jail. Like, we can get these resources in the community and all come together. So it's momentum that I want us to keep up, and use this to shape policy so lawmakers know where these resources are, and incarceration isn't the default. That isn't where we need to start. Let's really put more funding into these resources and expand them, and keep folks in the communities, keep folks healthy, keep folks able to access the level of care that they need. So COVID's been horrible, but that is a silver lining. We all have came together virtually to do those things.
Well, thank you guys so much. We're just about out of time, but I wanted to just let folks know, if they want to find out more about your work, where can they go to hear more, Amanda? Yeah,
so you can go to the ACLU of Kentucky webpage. There's a tab on there specifically for Smart Justice Advocates groups. You're absolutely invited to attend. These are folks with lived experiences and family members that come together to work on policy. That's where our policy is driven from, is these folks. So come, get involved. All are welcome.
Great. And Sheila, where can we find out more about you?
So you can learn more about the Drug Policy Alliance at drugpolicy.org. We are on all social media platforms, so find us on all of them. We have newsletters that we send out. We're very active on social media. We will let you know about sign-on letters and opportunities to let your legislators know, depending on where you live, about various opportunities and bills and legislation that they should be supporting. And and we can't do our work without really great donors and funders. So we appreciate any opportunity to talk about our work and to find connections with the things that are most impacting people's lives.
Well, thank you so much. That's all it for us here. Check out part 2 and keep up with everything unconventional at our website, justiceactionnetwork.org/unconventional, or with the hashtag unconventional series. Thanks.